Well, thank you very much, Katie, for that introduction, and especially for the opportunity to present today. I'm pleased especially because I've heard about the network and from other people that are involved in it, and this has been a great opportunity to learn more about it, and especially as you've been able to reflect now after a year of work. It's been wonderful to be able to sit back and listen to the things that you have been engaged in. So as Katie noted, that I'm wearing one of my hats, which is in trying to launch this new journal, Big Data and Society. And a lot of my talk is going to address some of the issues that we as an editorial team seek to address with this journal. I should note that I'm joined by 4 associate editors. One is Adrian McKenzie at Lancaster, a sociologist. Richard Rogers, who leads the Digital Methods Initiative at the University of Amsterdam. Judith Simon, who's a senior researcher at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and Matthew Suk, who is in the Department of Geography at the University of Kentucky. So we are a team that has just recently been assembled, and we're right now scoping out to get something live online so that you can read about the journal's aims and its scope. But our overall aim is to establish an international and interdisciplinary social sciences journal that is theoretically and what we say methodologically inclusive, but especially that it can provide a space and a hub for a lot of big data research and activities that are happening not only in the academy but also in industry and in businesses and in research centers, et cetera, and that are engaged not only in thinking about big data, but what we just term an emerging field of big data practices. And I can explain more what I mean by a field of big data practices later. But we want to focus on the differences for society that critical social science inquiries can make to our understanding of the methodological, the epistemological, the ontological, and political consequences that big data have for how we are known, in my case, how we are governed, and how we also come to enact our relations socially and politically. To do this, we are going to be seeking articles that engage, experiment with, and innovate methods. But do this through some critical, reflexive, and theoretically informed approaches. And finally, we want to innovate new publishing formats and are working to have a platform that will only be online, will only be digital. And we are seeking to integrate different forms of presentation that go beyond the standard academic article. And as many of you who work with big data know, the visualizations are key sometimes to the reporting of our research activities. And we're seeking to make this as dynamic and visually accommodating space as we can. So my talk today is going to build from many of the things that we've been thinking about in relation to the journal, including what we think we mean by big data, which is not an easy term to define, and there's lots of debate and discussion about it. But I think that the aims and scope of the journal are really nicely reflected in both the way this network originally constituted itself and through the discussions today is reflecting on what it's done. And what I mean by that is both doing and innovating methods, but at the same time questioning those very methods and trying to understand the work that those methods are doing. And I think that combination is especially crucial right now at this juncture when we are really talking about a science in the making. And that is a moment when we need to reflect, I think, on the kinds of things or sciences that we are making and engaging in. And I'm going to return to that point at the end of my talk, but I wanted to flag that at the outset because it's very much connected to the aims and purposes of the journal. So now, my thinking about what I call big data economies and ecologies originates from 2 research projects that I worked on over the last several years at the Center for Research on Social Cultural Change, or CRESC, which is a joint Open University and University of Manchester ESRC funded center. And I've worked on this with 2 people, Mike Savage and John Law. And one of the things that we've been writing about is what we call the social life of methods, which in brief is concerned with how methods are both shaped by the social and also shaping of social worlds. So this sort of dual, or we call double life kind of activity. And related to this, we did investigations of what we described as digital devices and data that are in the commercial, governmental, And I have to remember to hit this bar because I'm working on two computers, which is a bit of a coordination challenge, which is basically looking at how these devices and data in commercial, governmental, and social domains are operating and their implications for our social science methods and theories. And one of the themes that we explored in this was how digital data is being generated and analyzed in innovative ways in these domains, sometimes in similar ways, but sometimes in very contrasting and competing ones. But also how this data is quite unlike what we've traditionally worked with as social scientists, particularly where we've organized and generated data in the past for the purposes of our research, and instead now we're working with data that is generated and for other purposes in other domains. So to put it another way, what we sometimes describe as byproduct data, whether we're looking at purchases or online browsing or what we talked about this morning about tweeting, or even receiving a government service, which is an area that I do some research on, we have to rethink perhaps, especially the provenance of data that we work with. So we've looked at, for example, how forms of data are constituted in these different domains by specific social and technical relations. And they also generate different epistemologies and ontologies of the object or subjects of interest. For example, just to give you a little flavor of some of my current research, which is mostly, I should note, in the area of government databases, including open government data, but also data within government that is increasingly being joined up across government departments and linked in order to know populations in new and different ways. I've been doing an ethnography of EU statisticians because a lot of my work is on statistics, so it's nice to be here at the RSS to talk. And these meetings are about, on the one hand, mining existing government data to know populations instead of collecting it through censuses, for example, because governments have a lot of data. And if this data can be better mobilized, and especially linked, more detailed and granular knowledge of populations can be attained than any census that's conducted every 10 years could ever come close to or hope to ascertain. But also, they are talking about the future of official statistics in a world of big data, where things come faster and more detailed, and sometimes perhaps even in better arrays than any government can compile. So big data is also for government, just as it is for social scientists, seen as, on the one hand, an opportunity, on the other hand, perhaps a threat or a concern, but something that governments need to increasingly work with and learn and think about in terms of it as an alternate source. So through that, I'm looking at how this is leading to a change in what we can call statistical regimes that are not being simply driven by new theories or statistical principles, but of juggling a lot of political criteria, such as professional independence and national autonomy and supranational comparability, but also doing other things, meeting objectives such as what governments are all, or a lot of them are doing, is trying to reduce their costs. They're trying to reduce what is often called respondent burden. Stop asking questions of so many people when you've got a lot of data already that you're just not using, perhaps, as best you can, which is sometimes also referred to as transactional data of government. We use that word in relation to corporations, but governments also talk about their transactions with citizenry, whether it's through your DVLA license here in the UK or national insurance. These are transactional records of your existence in relation to government. And then, as I said, also big data sources such as mobile phone data or online browsing habits to look at consumer price indices or as indicators of consumer price indices. And we had some other examples earlier today. So certainly, as I said, government shares some of the concerns and interests in big data that were discussed here. And one of the ways that I've been trying to think about this changing statistical regime is to think about these data economies and data ecologies, and that this is what is changing, are the economies and ecologies of data. But first I want to go back to my question or point earlier about needing first to define or try to attempt a definition of what is big data. Now, I know you are speaking mostly about social media, and as I think someone earlier pointed out, that it's the one that most people understand first as big data, because it's the one, especially for research, that we have access to. So it is the one that perhaps we could say is the experimental ground on which we are looking at innovating methods. But there are lots of definitions that try to say, well, what is this data? And perhaps one of the most popular ones out there is commonly referred to as the 3 V's, which Stapleton at IBM, I think, came up with. And it's a definition that certainly dominated all of the big data sessions that I recently attended at the Association of American Geographers, which had many streams and papers on big data. First then, the most obvious one perhaps is it's just volume. And this is often cited as the first and the preeminent one that most people think about, probably because the term big data makes you think of something there's lots of it. But as a lot of people have noted, big data of the volumes that sometimes we're using today is not really that new. That in the 1980s, when researchers were first given access to the entire US census of population for 1980, that was some 100 gigabytes of data. It came from multiple different data sets, and at the time, and still is, considered quite a big data set. Or we have in the US also the Minnesota Population Project, which has been providing online access to harmonized, linked up, individual level data, so that's on individual people, since 1960. And that now contains data from 68 countries, 211 censuses, and some 480 million person records. That's big data. So in addition to volume, which of course, depending on the domain and the area of study, can vary between millions to billions of pieces of data, there's also the point about its velocity. And this is the one that, especially in government, the sort of real-time capacity or nature of big data, that when added to volume is especially seen as something that's different. So that speed of collecting and that ongoing collecting. And for censuses, as many of you know, it's every 10 years. That's not very real-time data. It's usually out of date, everyone says, once it's been published. So here, a source of data that is much more up-to-date, if you will, is very attractive. But also there's the variety that we're not only dealing with numerical data, but we're dealing with all the other formats, whether it's images or video or audio, and also the mixing and linking of some of these different sources that are also coming from different locations. And also with varying levels of granularity and detail that is unprecedented. But in relation to all 3 V's, it's also noted that here we have not just samples necessarily, but we have data of whole populations where it's a whole population connected to a particular platform or service. Of course, it's not a population in total, but it's about an activity or platform that the whole population and data can be had. And finally, because of all of these kinds of qualities, it's argued that new computational capacities and analytics and processing tools are needed to deal with these, that previous packages and statistics such as SPSS can no longer manage. And I know later you'll be talking about some of those kinds of tools that are out there. But I think to this we can also add that of value. There was a bit of discussion of value earlier on, and as this quote notes, and there are lots of other calculations, there's not only just big investments happening in big data, as this person points out, but also there's big value to be had through the mobilization and use of that data. But I want to note that my reasons for going through these particular qualities is to emphasize that bigness is not just about volume. But second, to introduce these, I want to argue that rather than definitions, they are really pointing to a variety of qualities, whether it's volume or variety. And it's these qualities that we need to point out as outcomes of specific practices, as opposed to in and of themselves, just naturally existing in kinds of data that we encounter. So for this reason, I've been suggesting the terminology of big data practices and using it to cover 3 kinds of practices that are connected to this field of practice. There's those, of course, that generate new kinds of data of varying volumes, formats, speeds, and value, and so on, from the online activities to mobile phone use and digitization. But there's also those that analyze it in innovative ways, and I think we're talking here a lot about those innovative analytics. But also do this with varying complexity, and it can involve formatting, cleaning, linking, mining, correlating kinds of activities. And both direct attention, I think, to new ways that data is being brought into being and captured and curated and formatted and stored and searched and linked and visualized, all of that kind of practice. But a third I call institutionalizing. And I started to think about this in particular because I know when I was first talking about the journal, my reaction was big data. I mean, that's not very scientific. What is big data? And a lot of people, when I talk to them about a journal called Big Data, think, is that really a term you want to use? And for a number of reasons, we've adopted it. And a big one is because institutionalizing practices are at work that are turning it into a field called big data. So if you want to look at investments, one can look at, research funders. The ESRC just announced £64 million of funding for big data capital investments. You don't have to stop there. Of course, you look at corporations and you can't but get away from big data departments and analytics happening. Research centers with that name, such as Intel in the US. There are projects such as my own called Socializing Big Data. There are publications, there are journals. There's another journal called Big Data that was just launched by Liebert in the United States. Mostly a computing sciences journal, but it's out there. So like any other field of practice, it's through these kinds of investments of concepts, terms, or capital that term and its meaningfulness and its existence, happen. So institutionalizing practices are also part, and this is jumped over to the next slide, so I hope I'm not losing you here. I don't know if this is on a timer or something, but I'll keep an eye on it, sorry. So it's a definition I put forward also to challenge what I see and others do as a tendency to naturalize big data by referring to it as a resource, a raw material to be mined or capitalized, which is, I guess, a lot of the talk you'll find in industry. There's even reference to it as the new oil that can be tapped to spur economies. And there are many examples of this kind of talk. This is one from an analyst at Lithium, a corporation that provides analytic tools for knowing its customers. Here, data is simply a record and a description. What then are needed are just techniques to analyze the data in its kind of native format. But this understanding of the raw value of big data isn't just conveyed in industry. We can also look to government references. And for example, we can think about economies of government raw data. Beyond being an evidence tool, as I think Jason and Jonathan discussed this morning, or of improving public service delivery, big data is also an economic generator, one to spur the economy. And here we have in the first quote, Cabinet Minister Francis Maud referring here to the Open Government Platform, which now contains over some 9,000, I think, data sets that have transactions of all departments as well as MPs' expenses and lots of other data. And here, again, big data in government is a means of spurring an economy by having private companies take up that data to innovate and do things with it. And this, of course, is also being advanced by the Open Data Institute that was recently launched by the UK government to help government and business identify commercially valuable public data, and that can, through this, nurture data-driven startups. And as we know, that's just around the corner from here at the so-called Silicon Roundabout area. But government is also interested in the value of private sector big data, such as credit card ratings or mobile phone usage, as I mentioned earlier. And also for mobilizing citizen activity and the use of data through initiatives such as the UK government's My Data project, which is currently voluntary, but may soon come under some regulation, which calls for utilities, web providers, and others to have machine-readable records available of their transactions so that customers can have insight into their own everyday consumption and lifestyle habits and can be empowered, as the government puts it, to analyze their actual behaviors and make better choices about what they're buying and doing. So government is interested in the mobilization of private sector data as having value as well. Now, there are many other references to how the rawness of data makes it possible, especially for non-human efforts, to then extract its value. By calling it raw, of course, there's also an inference that you don't need people to interpret it because it's just there, it's unmediated. And as these quotes indicate, it's not just only the answer, but it also forms the question. And this exchange, which was part of a discussion amongst computer scientists and industry leaders, points to another claim that big data constitutes a kind of bottom-up ontology, that instead of theories or a priori categorizations and hypotheses, which we as social scientists are quite aware and familiar with, ontologies come out of raw data such that data can be self-describing and not requiring those kinds of standard social science repertoires or approaches. And famously, of course, and this is perhaps far too much cited, and it was at several sessions at the AAG too, that there is an end of theory potentially at work if one can let the data do the talking, if you will. And this is the cited article by editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, Chris Anderson, back in 2008, where he suggested that instead of models explaining phenomena, that the human condition can now be revealed in a deluge of data that forces us, quote unquote, to view data mathematically first and establish a context for it later. And as suggested in the second quote, this is different from theory-driven research, which involves what we understand as deductive analyses, where an object of interest is defined a priori and then investigated. Instead, a data-driven research agenda involves inductive analyses where an object of interest, let's say the social or a collective, comes out of the data. Or as pointed out, I think, by someone this morning, a questioner, causality gives way to correlation as a way of understanding phenomena. Now, there's a lot of criticism about this, especially by social scientists who assert that data are already and always configured by both theoretical assumptions, by normativities, and so too are those analytic procedures we talk about that organize data and order it in particular ways to its interpretation, doing it in particular theory-laden ways, whether or not this is made explicit. But I think what these criticisms illustrate, I suggest, is exactly my point, that it is social and technical practices that both generate and analyze big data, and it's to those practices that we need to turn our attention. And that really brings me back to one of my starting points, that big data is often understood as a byproduct of what people do, or their digital practices, we could say again, that it's people practicing and doing things that generate data. But I think the language of byproduct is also apropos, given that much of what is understood as big data is largely generated or organized or mediated by different corporations, whether it's online via social networking platforms, or whether it's purchasing and browsing, or it's mobile devices. Indeed, I would argue that it's really difficult to separate out that any data, whether online or within government databases as I look at it, that's not mediated by corporate or economic practices, from the basic formatting of the data to technical infrastructures and analytic software. And those formats also extend to the open government data platform I just mentioned, where data is configured and organized in ways that are amenable to being taken up for corporate purposes and interpretation. So we can think about these kinds of mediating efforts, how they filter through many aspects of what is involved in the making and analysis of data. But I think we can extend this also to other IT practices of governments that involve, for example, contracting out infrastructures and analytics to corporations, such as in the case of a lot of census taking, which is now being done by Lockheed Martin. In this way, we can understand, I think, big data as a further extension of economic practices such that they now ever more configure data that's used for generating social, governmental, and of course our own academic knowledge. I think this is well captured in a phrase coined by Nigel Thrift in his Knowing Capitalism, that where we have a world that is saturated ever more with complex processes of social and cultural digitization, it is a world in which then the generation and mobilization and analysis of social data not only becomes more ubiquitous, but in which commercial practices come to predominate in both registering and knowing the social in detailed ways and on a continuous basis, and thereby also influencing our ideas of social worlds. But I think that such valuations of the economies need also to be extended to other kinds of capital that are also in formation as big data becomes ever more pervasive, whether it's social, cultural, or technical. On the one hand, we could add perhaps to some of the economic valuations that the government has already mentioned. We could talk about a real estate economy and the reconfigurations of Tech City or the Silicon Roundabout in London, with the beginnings and investments of startups, including all the coffee shops, which I think I'm a great beneficiary of, happening in this city just around the corner. But there are also technical forms in terms of expertise and reconfiguration in skills and expertise that are required to extract, analyze, and interpret data. And we could think about a changing hierarchy of technical capital and expertise. There's also cultural forms, again, that you have been addressing, whether it's the distributions of what is a recognized authority and influence, and the generation, mediation, and validation of social knowledge also as being reconfigured. And then, of course, there are social forms, whether one talks about collaboration or crowdsourcing or citizen science. But I think in addition to these economic forms, there are also myriad other elements at work, and there are complex dependencies and relays and relations between what we can think about as multiple elements and players involved. And for this reason, I start to think about these relations as constituting specific ecologies of people and of things and of representations, of realities, of different advocacies, of arrangements and circuits, and use that term to capture this. Now, it's not a term that I have necessarily come up with, but it's one that plays off a lot of the language, again, that is circulating in relation to understanding the complexities of a big data, in this case, a landscape. This is an illustration by Matt Turk. And so it's a terminology that's also plays off talking about ecosystems, to think about the interdependencies in this landscape. This includes here, in this illustration, many of the interrelated people and elements that make it up, from infrastructure to analytics we have here, to applications, to data sources, to open source projects, etc. And the idea of using that language is to highlight those kinds of interdependencies that involve lots of cycles and what are often also described of as feedback loops. So we could think of it as having, for example, these kinds of different actors and actants engaged. We have analysts, of course, with varying skills and expertise, and we're getting a new language of people and their positions, from, of course, the software developers to the data wranglers who clean and integrate and package data so it can be usable, to infomediaries who process and do that, what's called sometimes the heavy lifting of analysis, of aggregating and standardizing, and preparing it for our data scientists who can then glean or generate information out of all those kinds of data. It's also, of course, of infrastructures, not just people, but also handheld devices to cloud and network computing. It's computational. We've got analytic software, algorithms, and apps. And we have, of course, data inscriptions that come in various formats that have different kinds of boundaries. We've talked a lot today about, issues of privacy and access. Data is constantly being bounded and changed in terms of what's available. There's an understanding, I think, that's not captured in terms such as footprints or shadows, which also tend to naturalize data, but to think about inscriptions with these kinds of constraints and definitional practices surrounding it that is necessary. And of course, there's the users, who are also multiple, from individuals up to governments. And finally, we've talked a bit this morning about subjects, and I'm going to come back to this more at the end, but we have different subjects, from bloggers to browsers, the people who are doing the things that we are observing when we access and make use of big data. But it's because of the varying configurations and relays and relations between all of these that I think the language of a landscape or ecosystem, or as I've been using it, ecology, is adopted, or I would call it more multiple ecologies. I'm using the plural both for economies and ecologies because it's not one big, coherent system. I'm not a system analyst. There are many overlaps, perhaps. There are distinct ecologies in here and multiple dependencies. But I think pluralizing it is a good way of alerting us to that kind of understanding. So as a terminology also that I think accounts for the sharing that happens across data and analytic tools, and through their circulation leading to numerous dependencies and feedback loops. For example, in open government data, one feedback loop is that with transparency and making government data available, the very recording practices of government administrators is changing. Because one needs to now format and make available one's data, those practices begin to change. And we can see many kinds of feedback loops that happen when reuse is also taken up. That may also change data by filtering it, by shaping it, by cleaning it, by doing things with it. And this is why I refer to it as a liveliness. Data is not a constant. It is a moving object and a refigured object as it moves across different sites and domains, where things such as cleaning and formatting are not just simply fixing the data and making it better, but turning it often into something else. So in this way, I think big data can be understood as that set of practices that are part of this complex system of relays and associations and mediations and overlapping ecologies. So many people have said that these kinds of changes are having big epistemic effects. Basically because, on the one hand, of the distributed nature of devices and data, that there are various people and things engaged and invested in its generation and access is changing who is involved in the making of knowledge and what we know. Now, of course, I've worked in censuses and done statistical analysis in the past. Yes, I've used software and I've used other, infrastructures. It's not that infrastructures and software are new, but in terms of their distributions and in terms of our access and in terms of our engagement in the generation of those as well as the data, I think that's a shifting landscape. For example, some biologists who study data-driven biology argue that innovation in biology is not just coming out of its volume, but also coming out of the ways in which, as a science, it's organized and distributed and practiced, especially the calls for greater collaboration, greater divisions of labor, more integrative strategies in terms of modeling and design and theories and software setups. So instead of the individual biologist having more of a, if you want, control or say over the research that he or she is doing, this is now much more distributed and calls for a greater division of labor. And that has implications for the kind of knowledge that's generated. Of course, I think we can say the same for empirical social sciences. We are certainly part of data economies and ecologies that are quite different, as I said, from those that dominated in the past, whether one was doing surveys or interviews or panel studies or censuses. And through thinking of economies and ecologies, that's the kind of differences that I am trying to get at here. But I'd like to offer that the challenges are not just in regards to how knowledge or representation or epistemology are being reconfigured. I think we also have to think about how big data is also about big ontological effects of what is being done and what we often can say in a language of enactment or being enacted with big data. One way that I think about this, I take a position along with others that data and methods do not only represent, but they also bring people and things into being. That is, that representations and realities are being done simultaneously. And I'll give an example of this at the end. But big data practices are thus not only reconfiguring what we know, but then who we are as individuals and collectivities. And both of these epistemological and ontological effects are the products of those agencies and interventions that are dispersed and distributed. Thus, if we're talking about social science research and the reuse of this data, I think we can't talk about it as being independent or separate, but very much embedded in and part of those economies and ecologies. So we don't stand outside of those relations. And as you have argued earlier, maybe this is another way of understanding the blurring of boundaries, that perhaps those boundaries are being blurred ever more. And how then, do we attend to that is one of the challenges that faces us. In other words, social science methods can inhabit and help to reproduce particular ecologies that may involve specific advocacies or arrangements and representations and realities. Now, there are many consequences of this, and this is one of the aspects that we will hopefully stimulate in the journal. But the one I want to address here today is concerning what social sciences then can offer to our understanding of what big data means for societies. And I'm going to talk about two related approaches that I think are possible and necessary. Now, one builds on what's been happening through several decades of social science research and inquiries into how technologies are contingent achievements and accomplished by a lot of work and a lot of mediation and translation by myriad people and things, including political, cultural, and social norms that get embedded in methods. I think this is really important, especially in the face of claims that data is raw and unmediated, to go back to and think about those forms of inquiry. But it faces a particular set of difficulties, or raises the bar in terms of a number of difficulties that is often in place when one tries to interpret and analyze how data is done and comes into being and how it's analyzed. Now, for those of us who have worked in or continue to work with data from things such as surveys or censuses, for example, we have a long tradition of scouring metadata and documentation on methods, as well as following what are relatively standardized procedures and protocols to assess the quality of data. And we do a lot of work on trying to understand how that data is generated, interpreted, and evaluated through that kind of looking at the stuff behind the data as a way into that. But I think with big data, this is being ever more pushed into the background, or what STS researchers have called black boxed. It's less available to us in terms of the rules and procedures and practices involved in the generation of that data, including the practices of subjects or users themselves, and not only those of the designers of a platform or of a database. And even with government, whom I work with a lot, statisticians, when they seek to join up administrative data across government departments, face the same conundrum. They wish to have data that meets statistical principles for statistical purposes, and they run into constant problems of the lack of documentation within a particular government department as to how that data was compiled or cleaned and organized, or data that was done and cleaned and organized in a variety of ways, so that joining it up is not a simple matter of addition, but you are joining up actually very different practices and methods. But their problem at times is just not having the kind of provenance behind the data available to them. So in other words, trying to account for how data is being done is becoming increasingly difficult to do, and may well serve perhaps to reinforce the rawness of data as something to be worked with, because you can't get access to it. And as someone I think also noted this morning, that this perhaps could be addressed by working with those generators. Someone asked, could we not work with the commercial sector to make these ordering principles more transparent and accessible? A laudable idea, but I think as someone else mentioned, is it practical? Is it possible? Is this going to happen? But I think there's another strategy, and that's the one that I would like to talk about at the end here, is to focus on questions of what is done with data. What is it used for? What is it used to enact? What kinds of realities are elevated through one's use and take-up of that data? And I think that's both an ontological and political question. And in this regard, I'm thinking about what I'm currently calling, and I may not stick to this, decisive data, and mobilizing effects, and the sort of double meaning of that. Mobilizing effects as a kind of intentionality to mobilize and to enact particular worlds, but mobilizing effects is to also have effects coming out of what we do. It's kind of a move, I think, to understand that the reality of data is to be found in those effects. That is, the worlds that it comes to actualize, legitimize, and create when it's taken up. That is, rather than just questions of epistemology. And since what makes that data is distributed and sometimes out of reach to us and difficult to trace, to think of decisive data is to ask the ontological questions about what is enacted, or what John Law and Anna Marie Moll have called an ontological politics. For example, what are the politics of knowing people on the basis of what they do through track and trace technologies, which of course includes ethics and politics of privacy and surveillance. But the inquiry I'm suggesting is a bit different. While important, I think we also have to put our gaze on other kinds of inquiries. And it particularly concerns the kinds of people, collectivities, and social orderings that are being made up and made more important, perhaps. Or in philosopher Ian Hacking's language, as he puts it, the forms of being that methods elevate and reinforce, and then the forms of resistance and contestation that perhaps they close off. And this involves inquiries and external critiques, if you will, of not only the methods of corporations and governments, though I do think this is what a critical social science can do, but also of the very social science methods that we're forging today. So if I was to pose a question for a critical social science, I would say it needs to engage with big data and do big data, if you will, but at the same time, through reflexive orientation, to ask the kind of difficult and hard questions of what it means to work with that data and to enact particular ways of being in particular worlds. I think that's some of the questions that you were asking or posing this morning, that through the take-up of data and methods, what ways of being are we reinforcing and elevating, and what forms or ecologies and economies are we participating in? And then how are these tied up with big data? How are those data and devices we're working with framed, managed, and configured by various others, and what are the interests in those economies and ecologies of others? And I'm going to provide one example in closing, because I think there's always, when you get too conceptual and more abstract, it can leave people feeling a bit puzzled. Now, I started at the beginning by noting that big data are usually registers of what people do, but I want to nuance that a bit here. If we think about big data practices, we could say that they turn people into subjects of research, or subjects of commerce, or subjects of government. And it's in relation to particular ordering principles of a specific platform or service that that subject is brought into being. That is, we have people, of course, on platforms, but as subjects, they're not pre-existing, but are formed by those devices. We didn't have tweeters before we had Twitter, for example, as a very simple example. It's the platform that is generative of a particular subject, sometimes called a user, but I will use subjectivation as an argument and a concept for thinking about what it is to work in a domain such as Twitter. And the same, of course, we can say about any methods that we have used in the past and continue to use, whether it's the survey or the interview, which are not about what people do, but what they say, or how they account for themselves or ask to account for themselves. And as many others have noted, such as Mike Savage or Nicholas Rose, that self-eliciting and accounting subject is a product of our 20th century inquiries, whether it's the interview or survey. So the question then is, what kinds of subjects are big data practices and our methods eliciting and producing? For example, is behavior now the basis on which subjects are identified and enacted by our methods, while categories of identity and meaningfulness become less relevant? If so, with what consequences? Can our subjects speak back? Or are we returning perhaps, as Mike Savage has suggested, to 19th century and early 20th century observational technologies practiced by knowledgeable observers who only need to see but not ask? Now, the point is that, again, all methods produce their subjects and not only have different epistemological and ontological effects, but I think also political and ethical ones. And it is finding a language and a set of concepts or conceptual tools that we as social scientists can think about, and perhaps that can be one of our contributions to this growing field. But I think our challenge is to find ways of being accountable and answerable to methods and to all of these effects, as opposed to throwing our hands up in the air. Now, I think your network has clearly contributed to thinking about ethics, and I invite you to extend this to engage in a debate about our responsibilities as researchers that go beyond questions of ethics, perhaps. And as someone else commented this morning, big data is being hoovered up, and I like that term. It's happening in Tech City, it's happening elsewhere, and many of these considerations are not a concern of people who are using big data. And perhaps this is where we as social scientists can potentially make an important contribution, is to asking these kind of difficult questions and to be answerable to our analytics and to our methods. And also, as you've noted today, methods are perhaps overtaking consideration of these because things are moving so quickly. And I think that was in the way the network was set up was, wow, it happens so fast. The only way that we can keep up is perhaps through talking to each other. I find it very frustrating just to keep on top of big data because it's big. There's just so much happening, you know, on Twitter streams or on new projects and sites and people that it's very difficult, especially when you extend it to an international scene. It just becomes ever more, you know, complex. But I think it's critically important that we break down potential silos and that we do attempt to work across disciplines, which is one of the objectives of the journal, but also that we also talk to business, industry, and others, which is another one of our challenges of the journal is to invite, you know, people. We have people on our board, you know, from industry and business, and we hope to, through that, you know, engage people outside of the social sciences disciplines. So I think it's critically important if we're to make a contribution that's beyond what other people are doing in terms of analyzing, you know, social media in your case, because there are a lot of social media analysts out there. A lot of geographers are doing it, as I've learned the past few days. So I would perhaps end there to say that is our sort of challenge, and that one of them, you know, or if I was to put it another way, we've faced this challenge before in the mid part of the last century when we had the quantitative revolution. What we ended up doing perhaps then was creating big divides between qualitative and quantitative. I think a very problematic divide. I think we are, or I hope we are not going to try to create new divides in this sort of big data practice or field, and that will be our challenge to sort of break down those and also realize that especially today, you know, engaging across sectors and across disciplines is ever more important if we're going to understand and positively, if you will, shape this field. Thank you.